My name is Sam Hoggett, and I'm the Chancellor here at UCSF, and it's just a thrill for me to welcome you all here, and for those that are watching this via live stream for our Stand Up for Science teach-in. I'm not sure, I think it would have to be exam finals or a Stand Up for Science teach-in that would get everyone out of bed and here at 8:30 on a Saturday morning, so thank you all for being here. So as a public university, UCSF is firmly grounded in the belief that the expansion of knowledge through scientific discovery is necessary for our society's freedom and prosperity. We also believe very strongly that our strength as a university stems from a culture that embraces diversity and inclusion and respects every individual, regardless of their religion or national origin. We've organized today's Stand Up for Science teach-in and the other events that we'll be holding this morning to reaffirm and celebrate these core values. We have a group of scientists here this morning who exemplify UCSF's mission of advancing health worldwide. They have taken on challenging scientific questions and dedicated their careers to bettering the health of people locally and around the globe. These efforts have at times clashed with political sentiments, and this is what we're going to focus on this morning. I want to thank each of our speakers, as well as the organizers of today's events, including the Gladstone Institutes and the California Life Science Association, who are co-sponsoring both the teach-in and the rally afterwards. Now, the teach-in itself would not have been possible without the vision and leadership of Claire Brindis, who's our professor and director of UCSF's Institute for Health Policy Studies. Claire really conceived this idea and has championed it throughout. I'd also like to thank the staff from both University Relations, the UDAR events team, and from Finance Administration and from the Chancellor's Office, who have collaborated to make these events possible with relatively short notice. I can only tell you in my office the enthusiasm and passion over the last few days has really been quite remarkable. So now I'm going to turn things over to our moderator this morning, Mike McCune. Mike is a professor of medicine in UCSF's Department of Experimental Medicine. He's a basic science researcher who has dedicated his career to working on HIV, its pathogenesis, prevention, treatment, and cure. Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks to all of you who are here and those of you watching from afar. It's great to see so many people this morning. It's a day, I think, it's fair to say we're learning to do and to teach things that we like to do, and this has been something that's particularly happy for me to have an opportunity to do from UCSF. I've been here for many years with my wife, over 35 now. We've loved every minute of it. We particularly enjoyed the commitment that the institution has had to excellence, to open inquiry, to collaboration, to tolerance of new ideas, and most importantly, I think, to the application of these ideas to the betterment of the world. This is really why we are here to do what we do, is it not? It's to discover nature, the facets of nature, to understand what they mean, and then to apply that knowledge to help the well-being and the health of people around the world. This is not an easy task. I think all of you know that. It's something that takes a lot of time and effort and patience, persistence, a dollop of idealism. And this is what we're going to talk about today with the faculty members that you see here in front of you. These are some amazing people. They come from diverse disciplines. They're at the top of their game. We're not going to talk about the nitty-gritty of their research today. That's not what this is about. What they're going to tell you about is how they've taken the information that they've learned and tried to apply it to sensible practices and policies that can benefit all. All of them, as Sam had mentioned, have run into obstacles along the way. Usually it has to do with sentiments, political sentiments that run counter to the facts that they've uncovered, but they have been perseverant and persistent and have tried to move those facts to the light of day and to allow sensible policies and practices to emerge. Now, in a university like UCSF with thousands of faculty members, you must realize this is just the tip of the iceberg. And there are many in the university, many in this audience, I am sure, who've been doing the same thing. And if you're one of those, you should pat yourself on the back, I think, and keep on. And for those of you who are relatively new to the game, I think one of the main goals of this day is to teach you what it is that we're doing and how to do it so that you can continue to do it going on into the future. With that, I'll describe the format of the day. Will be that we'll have each of the speakers spend about 5 to 6 minutes talking about their experience, after which we'll have an open period for questions and answers, so keep them in mind and you can ask them at the end of this time. Our first speaker will be Dr. Susan Fisher, who is a professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive sciences, and who will talk about her advocacy of human stem cell research. Susan?
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone this morning for coming out to stand up for science so early on a Saturday morning. We're truly inspired. I'm here to tell you about the tremendous impact that the federal grant system that supplies money for our research has had on my research program at UCSF. I started receiving federal support for my research as an undergraduate. I had an NSF fellowship to support my undergraduate research, and I had NIH funding for my graduate and postdoctoral fellowship. Yay, NIH funding. Yes. So when I came to UCSF, I very much expected to write grants to the government to support my work here at UCSF. And I want to say at the outset how incredibly grateful I have been for this support. It's made much of my work possible here at UCSF. But what I didn't expect was the tremendous influence of politics and the sentiment about science would have on funding for my work. And a good example of this is our work in stem cells. We derive human embryonic stem cells from human embryos that are left over after the end of in vitro fertilization treatments. And it's important to realize that these embryos would degrade over a number of years in frozen storage if we did not use them for the purpose of trying to help people. They're really important tools for science, but I think that what most of the public is interested in is the fact that they can be used for regenerative medicine therapies. They're being differentiated into cell types that can replace those cells that go wrong in chronic diseases such as diabetes. The federal government has decided not to fund work such as ours, which makes it incredibly challenging. We've had to get funds for this work from non-traditional sources, such as philanthropy, and here in California from the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which was funded by Prop 71, which is really a good example of what the citizens of our state can do if we band together for science. So this non-federal nature of the work we do has had tremendous implications for what goes on in my lab. And I'm going to tell you 3 very short stories about what's happened and that really illustrate some of the difficulties that we face. The first is about a paper that we published a few years ago about the first step in establishing human pregnancy, which is called implantation. This paper had data in it from human embryos, and it was published at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. By 4 o'clock Western Time in our time zone, I had an email from the U.S. Congress listing all of my NIH grants and asking me which one had supported our embryo work. So I was so surprised by this. I was amazed that they were watching what we did so closely, and I was very surprised that they would catch us out, try to catch us out on rules that we knew very well, because we had abided by the rules and used non-federal funds for this work. The second story is about the fact that since this work was non-federal, it had to be done off campus. So we were deriving our first lines in a very substandard lab away from our normal, really wonderful facilities at UCSF. We had our first stem cell lines growing, and there was a big Pacific storm, and we lost power in that lab. So we had to sit idly by as we watched these stem cells slowly die in the incubator that was keeping them alive but no longer had power. The third story is about a new way we've come up with for deriving human embryonic stem cells. We've been able to take one cell out of a 3-day embryo and make a cell that we think is a more potent kind of stem cell. But the federal definition of a human embryonic stem cell line is that it comes from a 5-day-old human embryo and not a 3-day-old human embryo, which is what we used. Therefore, the government won't register these lines, and again, we can't get NIH funding for them. So I hope that my 3 stories have inspired you to stand up for science, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Susan. Our next speaker will be Dr. Stebon Burchard, a professor of bioengineering in the schools of pharmacy and medicine. He'll talk about his work in advocating for the scientific advantages of including diverse populations in the research that we do. Stebon?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming on a Saturday morning so early. Since World War II, the United States has been at the forefront of science and technology. 10% of all patents in the United States have derived from the NIH. 30% of all patents have cited work that was funded by the NIH. I'm a physician scientist. I study genetics in minority populations. In the last 10 years, we've identified more genes than in the entire history of modern genetics. However, there's a law on the books requiring the inclusion of women and minorities that was put in place in 1993. And I'm sad to say that as of today, 96% of all modern genetic and biomedical research has focused in on populations of European origin, and we published that in Nature in 2011. And to have clinical relevance, the #1 blockbuster drug for heart attacks and strokes doesn't work in 50% of Asians, 70% of Pacific Islanders. So if any of you that are Asian have a heart attack today and go to UCSF, you're going to get that drug, and it's basically a placebo, and they're playing Russian roulette with your life. So that drug was made on formulary in Hawaii, and I'll remind you that Hawaii is a Pacific Island, and a lot of Asians. And so we assisted the Attorney General of Hawaii to sue Bristol Myers Squibb, and that's some of the advocacy that we do. But I study asthma in children, and there are tremendous racial and ethnic disparities. And the biggest predictor of drug response for albuterol, which is the most commonly prescribed asthma medication in the world, is ethnic background. And when we looked at the NIH, because they do analysis of us, I did analysis of them, and we found that in the last 20 years, less than 5% of their pulmonary research has focused in on minority populations. And so, in some sense, I've been a gadfly to the NIH, and I've met with Congresswoman Lee. She dragged in Francis Collin to Congress, and because of that, the NIH has dramatically improved their portfolio with respect to diversity. And I got on the precision medicine team with President Obama and was able to increase the diversity with respect to gender, geographic diversity, and socioeconomic status, as well as racial and ethnic diversity. So this is an important time, though. So I want to tell you the yin and yang of this, because although I've been a gadfly, I recognize that this is not the time to cut the NIH. You know, we're making significant advances in inclusion of diverse populations and inclusion of globally or geographically diverse populations. And that's relevant because one of the first things that Trump cut were the IDEA grants, which fund the flyover states, the Oklahomas, the Puerto Ricos, the Wyoming, where we get have a lot of talented researchers, but they just don't have the infrastructure for NIH funding. And also, this is not a time to cut the NIH because of the changing demographics of the United States. 47% of the U.S. population is non-European, yet, like I said, most of the research is done in European populations and generalized. And so we need to fund the NIH and support them to keep up with the changing demographics of the United States. So what have I done to do this? And it's very important for me to focus on my research and staying funded, but I've devoted a significant amount of my time in the last several months to advocate on behalf of the NIH, and that's the yin-yang component of what I do. I met with Congresswoman Barbara Lee staffers recently. I met with Tom Price's undersecretary, John Bardis. Through my professional society, I am going to try to get a meeting with Congress to educate them on the importance of clinical and biomedical research as it relates to all populations in the world. And that's forthcoming. And all of the people in my lab, we have to focus on good science, but we can't do science in a vacuum. And so a big component of my work is advocacy. Advocacy for preserving the NIH, preserving the Center for Disease Control. And that funds the work that we do, and it's important for not only us as scientists, but us as a populace and the clinical and biomedical world. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'm glad you came this morning.
Thanks, Stebon. I'd like to introduce you now to Rebecca Smith-Feinman, who's a professor of radiology, epidemiology, and biostatistics, and who's worked hard to establish standards in the field of radiology, and she'll talk to you about that.
Good morning, everyone. I too want to thank you all for showing up, but not because it's a Saturday morning. I mean, that's impressive, but I think what I've learned and what I want to share in my experience is that showing up at the right table and taking advantage of the right opportunities is a really important part of what we need to do as scientists if we really want to get to the goal of really improving healthcare, which is what we mostly want to do. We don't want to just publish important papers. We want to have them change healthcare. So I'm a radiologist. Radiology is the area of medicine that deals with medical diagnosis, so CT scans, MR, ultrasound is the area that I work in. Medical imaging is extraordinary and has really had a huge impact on medical care. I would guess by a show of hands that probably a third of the people in this room have had an imaging test this year. And if you look at CT scanning, 1 in 5 people get a CT scan every year. So we use a lot of medical imaging. I'm a fan of imaging. Doctors, patients are all fans of imaging. But one of the things that's happened with imaging is it's grown so rapidly, 400% in the last 15 or 20 years, that we haven't really paid attention to the fact that there are trade-offs with imaging. There are both risks and benefits. Everyone knows that about, let's say, a new medication or a surgical procedure, but we haven't really thought about that so much in imaging. We just thought it was perfect. And as a result, no one's really quantified it, and so my research lab focuses on quantifying the risks and benefits of imaging so we can try to use it more appropriately. One of the harms of imaging, or potential harms, has to do with radiation exposure. I'm going to share a little bit of my experience in that world. CT scanning, ultrasound, CT scanning, fluoroscopy uses X-rays. And X-rays are a known carcinogen. Carcinogen is a big word meaning it causes cancer. It doesn't cause cancer in a lot of patients, but it's a very well carcinogen. Actually, no carcinogen has been studied more than radiation, and that means that it will lead to cancer in some patients who undergo it. And not only is it a carcinogen, there are very few standards about how we do medical imaging. So the radiation we use is not really overseen by anyone. And what that means is if you go to an emergency department with flank pain, back pain, if you go to one emergency department, you might get a dose of 2 millisieverts. That's kind of the dose you get by walking around the planet. There's radiation all around us. But if you go to a different emergency, then you might get a dose of 200 millisieverts, so 100-fold higher. And sort of that's what I learned in my research, and that's what I published. And I thought, oh my goodness, look what I found. We have to sort of create some rules and regulations and get my professional societies interested in it. And it turned out, while radiologists, of course, want what's best for our patients, they weren't as interested as I tend to be in having standards and having oversight and having rules. And not because they didn't care about the topic, but they didn't like the idea of bringing attention to this region, because that might mean people might not use as much imaging if we knew it had a potential harm. And because as physicians, quite honestly, we like to regulate ourselves. We don't like oversight. And so I realized quickly that publishing the science in good medical journals wasn't going to get me where I wanted to go to improve practice. And so that really not shifted, but required an extra step. And that step is sort of getting involved in advocacy. And that's sort of, I sort of split my time between mostly running my lab and having NIH grants, and then really getting involved in advocacy. And what that meant for me was really both accepting opportunities when I was invited to participate in areas to educate people, but also seeking out those opportunities. And so when I say opportunities, it meant for me bringing stakeholders on board, bringing people to the table and saying, this is an important topic, right? It's sort of a very nuanced, detailed topic that no one thinks about, and I want the people to think about it. So as part of that, when I published papers, I would speak to the press a lot and tell them about the issue. I was invited to speak before the U.S. Congress on several times, and I jumped at those opportunities. And when I say jumped at those opportunities, Rebecca, have you ever spoken? I was like, no. Would you like to? Definitely. And then I was like, oh no, I don't know how to do this. I have to learn how to do this. This is way over my head. But I've spoken to Congress, I've spoken to state senators, I've spoken to national meetings of state legislators, I've spoken to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, I've spoken to the FDA. I've written quality measures. I'm a radiologist. I'm not a quality measure writer, but no one else was writing quality measures, so I've written quality measures. I've worked with organizations to get them to use those quality measures. I really started to realize that while the space that I'm most comfortable in is crunching numbers, I'm a numbers person. I use big, large databases, and I evaluate, let's say, radiation dose in millions of patients, but that's not enough to change practice. To change practice, I have to get that information out there in good scientific journals, but I also need to make awareness of this issue outside of my small insular community. And I think I've had some success, I've had some failures in that, but it's really changing in my mind what my role as a scientist is. So my main identity is a scientist, and I think you need to be able to stand behind really good science. So I'm in no way saying your science should suffer. But I think if you really want to change practice, sometimes that means going beyond the science and really moving into a world of teaching people about what you do and the importance of what you do. And it's been a real honor to get to do this at UCSF, and a definite honor to get to share it with you. So as I started showing up at the right table and learning what the right table is, I think is part and parcel of what you need to do if you really want to change practice. For some of you, you may not have to do that. It may be that you'll publish a paper and then it will be adopted widely and everyone will change their practice because of it. I don't know anyone either who's had that experience, but for most people I know it's sort of a slog to do the science, and it's also a slog to get people to listen to it. So thank you for being able to share my experience.
Thanks, Rebecca. Cherie Boyer will speak next. Cherie is a professor of pediatrics and adolescent medicine, and she'll talk about her efforts advocating for work on the reproductive health of military personnel, particularly female recruits.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Yes, my work is in reproductive health for adolescents and young adults, specifically trying to prevent sexually transmitted infections and HIV. And I've been doing this for 2.5 decades now. But I was asked today to speak specifically about one experience in conducting research, particularly with the Department of Defense. So I'll give you a little scenario by way of context. Sexually transmitted infections are epidemic among adolescents and young adults. About half of those that are diagnosed, of the 20 million cases diagnosed annually, are among 15 to 24-year-olds. And about 1/4 of all sexually active adolescents are diagnosed with an STD annually. So therefore, there is a dire need to continue to focus on sexually transmitted infections. We know that it's important because there are serious and long-term consequences to having an STI, particularly an asymptomatic STI for young women, including ectopic pregnancy, chronic pelvic pain, high risk of cervical cancer, and increased risk of HIV transmission. So therefore, it is important to address what might seem as something as benign as a bacterial STI. Also, in addition to focusing on STIs, unintended pregnancies are very high in young people. Even though the rates have declined, they're higher in this country among any other Western country in the world, and that also there are consequences, there are social and health consequences for adolescent young women who experience pregnancy as a teen, including lack of the ability to complete high school or college, having increased access to having more reliability on public assistance, for example, and having a lower earning potential over the course of her life. So therefore, it is important to also focus on how do we prevent unintended pregnancies in this young population. And our group here at UCSF have been on the forefront for many years in working not only on prevention, but also on diagnostics, on non-invasive screening, and we were doing that very well and have been doing that for many, many years. And in doing so, we were contacted by military medicine personnel who was saying, like, well, we're seeing these STIs in these young people. They're coming in with high rates. They go out on deployments and they're contracting infection, and all we can do is to keep treating them, but we're not addressing the problem. So they asked us to help them think through this and how they could impact these high rates of STI in their population. And so after working with them for a number of months on this and engaging in some really interesting research, doing shipboard studies on young men who are deployed and helping them to figure out ways of doing actual prevention that didn't involve just scare tactics, we were helping them to think through that and how they could use their personnel to do that. And lo and behold, we sought funding and got funding from the Department of Defense, but the Biomedical branch. And as you know, the Department of Defense is huge, and there's a lot of activity there, and lots of different commands, and they don't all line up, and it's not one just unit. It's a huge bureaucracy, not surprising. So we got funding from the Biomedical branch, and we thought, okay, we could do this. Now we could go in and implement the science we know. We were on the cutting edge of the work that was going on, so we could go in and do this. Not so easy. It made more sense that young people who are coming into the military have higher rates of STIs and unintended pregnancy than the average civilian population appears their age. So it made more sense to address this when they came in, right at recruit training. But that was not so easy a task, because the mission of recruit training is to train a troop of combat-ready soldiers, right? Troops that are combat-ready. That's their mission. Health wasn't a part of that equation. So, needless to say, it was an uphill battle to convince the powers that be that were in charge of combat-ready soldiers is to take away any time away from their training mission, right? Because if they took those 10 to 13 weeks that they're being trained, if they took an hour away from that to focus on health, that was one less hour that they were going to be ready for combat duty, even though we weren't in war at the time. But anyway, we had to work with our colleagues. The military preventive medicine group got it. They wanted this. So they worked with us to get an audience with admirals, with generals, with whomever would talk, who owned the soldiers of the training command, who were up the chain of command for the military preventive medicine group. So not all of them on the same page. So we spent months and months, weeks and weeks going around the country, the East Coast, Japan, Hawaii, talking to whomever would talk with us. Finally, we had an opportunity to meet with a woman general who was in charge of training women. And she recognized the importance of the health of the women that she was training. And so she allowed us the opportunity to come in to help with the screening, to teach them about non-invasive screening, to allow us 8 hours of training for prevention, which was the standard for our field in terms of prevention education. And fast forwarding 2 years in doing so, we really did come up with an efficacious protocol for them. And the one thing that we learned was, one, being patient, being persistent, fitting in, not really trying to shake things up, to make sure that we were respectful of what existed so that we were allowed to do science, do really good science. And then so that we can then leave something. And so we wanted to train those that were interested, the preventive medicine technicians, the doctors, on how to do this screening appropriately. We provided a straightforward protocol for the training instructors to figure out how to do prevention education without using scare tactics or using scare tactics alone, which was the standard then. And in doing that, we left behind something that changed the way that this particular branch of the military dealt with reproductive health of the women. I can say that it's not true for men, don't receive this type of prevention, and not all the services receive it. But what we know is that we changed the culture there, and that when we left, there was something in place for them to hold on to, in which they continue to do, as to my knowledge, to this day. And interestingly enough, we've come full circle. The Department of Health and Human Services Office of Adolescent Health has utilized this particular scientific intervention that shows evidence to be one of their evidence-based intervention that they're funding for replication for at-risk young people in the country. So it's come full circle, and by persistence, good science, trying to figure out ways to working with difficult cultures that you can be successful in changing something as important as the reproductive health of women. Thank you for your time.
That's great, Shuri. Our next speaker is Jim Kahn, who's a health economist with the Institute of Health Policy Studies. Jim has also worked on efforts to prevent HIV disease, and he'll talk to us about those efforts.
Good morning, and I'm pleased to participate on the panel. My work builds on the idea that formal synthesis of scientific evidence about health intervention, efficacy, and cost provides essential guidance to help us effectively and efficiently fight disease, to maximize health for the most people. This philosophy turns out to be surprisingly controversial. In particular, when science runs up against values or politics, it can take a beating. Luckily, in my experience, careful analysis often garners support that leads to better health policies and programs. I'll discuss 3 examples. In 1992, HIV was spreading quickly among drug users through shared needles. A few local needle exchanges were trying to reduce this risk. However, the White House refused to officially state that needle exchange reduces HIV transmission. Moral opposition to drug use was spilling into HIV prevention debates. Many believed, despite the available evidence, that needle exchange encourages drug use. So the CDC hired a team at UCSF to assess the broad effects of needle exchange. My responsibility was to quantify the impact on HIV infections and cost. We found, and the federal government ultimately accepted, that needle exchange reduces HIV infections and saves lives at a very affordable cost without encouraging drug use. I want to convey a fascinating experience that I had in this project, and I ponder to this day. Early on, I interviewed a minister from a church in the black community in New Haven, Connecticut. He very thoughtfully but resolutely stated that he was morally opposed to needle exchange because it seems to condone drug injection. End of discussion, apparently. Yet, 6 months later, at a meeting to present our results, this minister looked over at my laptop screen, seeing a special technique we call sensitivity analysis, which showed that even allowing for the substantial uncertainty in the evidence, needle exchange saves lives very efficiently. He said, in that case, I can support needle exchange. To my amazement, a profoundly humble idea, documenting our uncertainty, was the key to reaching an absolute moral barrier. What's the lesson here? Perhaps that humility in science is a better selling strategy than certainty. Or perhaps that a persistent focus on saving lives is what matters. In 2005, I was drawn into another fraught HIV prevention debate: voluntary adult male circumcision to prevent HIV in Africa. Despite being standard at birth in some major religions, male circumcision in adults was perceived by some vocal critics as a violation of human rights. Clinical trials and associated analyses were attacked as unethical. I was invited to conduct an economic analysis by a French clinical researcher who published the first randomized trial of circumcision for HIV prevention. The trial found that circumcision reduces HIV infection risk by more than half. We then estimated that circumcision cost just $174 per HIV infection averted. Once again, we considered all the uncertainty we could find. Any way we looked at the evidence, adult male circumcision saved lots of lives. My studies and others like it led to a World Health Organization recommendation for widespread offering of circumcision. And I'll end with the work that got us the most attention, both supportive and critical. In 2002, we published a review in Lancet that found that per dollar spent in Africa, HIV prevention provides 30 times the health benefit of HIV treatment. We propose that if funds are limited, as they were, it's important to first fund HIV prevention, even if it delays scale-up of treatment. This view was endorsed by some in the HIV policy and research community who said, more or less, no surprise here. However, it was actively, indeed vociferously, critiqued by some prominent health advocates who accused us of throwing people out of lifeboats. In the end, the global HIV control effort shifted with impressive new funds to a focus on treatment. So in a sense, our advice was ignored. Yet, we were told that our paper helped preserve an ongoing role for prevention, which is contributing meaningfully to current epidemic control. I'm very glad we provoked spirited discussion, despite the attacks we received. I encourage others to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker is Andre Campbell, a professor of surgery, who will talk to us about his efforts to influence policymakers in the community about the public health problems of guns, violence, and trauma. Andre?
Now, good morning. I didn't hear you. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Andre Campbell. I am a trauma surgeon. Also, some people know me as Dr. Dre. Now, I was Dr. Dre before Dr. Dre was Dr. Dre. I'm older than you. I want to thank Claire, Brenda's, the esteemed faculty members who are here, both the Chancellor, Dean, and Mike for inviting me to speak today. Now, this is a Stand Up for Science session, and I was wondering, why would you invite a surgeon to speak about that? Isn't that like an oxymoron, surgery, science? No, it's not. But I'm honored to be here to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Advocacy 101, and I'm going to talk about 3 types of advocacy in the time I have today. The first type is advocating for your patients and my experience with that, advocating for issues including gun violence and other things, and advocacy for important institutions that we have in our community. So the first thing is, as a physician, I learned how to be an advocate when I was a resident. I had a very sick patient who had, because of trauma, he had jumped or fell 4 stories. He was hurt really badly. He ended up being in a hospital for a prolonged period of time. And it turns out that he was, let's say, because of his visa status, the hospital I worked at refused to have me finish operating on him. But it took me a few months, but I beat them down, and I was able to do the operation that had to be done. So I say that if you're a physician, right, make sure you advocate for your patients. If you are not a physician, advocate for your family members who are sick, who are in the hospital to do things. So I ended up joining the team at San Francisco General Hospital because I was very comfortable because I had 1,300 other people who were advocates like I was there. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years at San Francisco General Hospital, advocating for my patients to make sure to get the best care possible. The second thing I want to talk about is advocacy and gun violence and kind of what has been done both locally and nationally as surgeons for this. Now, you may or may not know this, but over 20 years ago, as a result of the Balanced Budget Amendment of 1997, they ceased funding for science related to gun violence. I mean, you have to understand that 8,000 people die, 8 to 10,000 people die every day of homicides, 20,000 people die of suicides related to firearms, and nobody's studying it. Now, finally, after all this moratorium and under the Obama years, things started to change. In 2013, NIH started to fund it again, and slowly but surely, we started to sort of get data about, okay, well, how can we predict somebody's going to be injured? What's going to do that? So it's important that we basically continue to study this. Now, as the political climate has changed, that is going to be more of a challenge, and that's why we need to be here doing what we're doing here today. I'll say a few words about the Sandy Hook Massacre and kind of how that has affected our group as trauma surgeons nationally. So it happened after a terrible day of unspeakable violence in 2012, December 14, at Sandy Hook, where 20 lovely children and 6 teachers were killed. What happened was there was a group that was created that had trauma surgeons, politicians, public health advocates that basically looked at a way to stop this violence. And what happened was the Hartford Consensus Project started, and out of that they said, well, what can we do to sort of make a difference as healthcare providers and trauma surgeons? And out of the Hartford Consensus process and a lot of pushing by one of my friends, Len Jacobs, who headed the Hartford Consensus, we started this campaign called Stop the Bleed. Now, Stop the Bleed is something that now is a national effort that is going on, and we're trying to train every single person in ways to stop people from bleeding. That means that because what they found is that people die after mass casualty situations because they bleed out. And if you put direct pressure, you put a tourniquet, or you use hemostatic dressings, that you can make a difference in doing that. And the whole idea with Stop the Bleed is that, as well as CPR, where you have automatic implantable defibrillators, there should be a kit to help stop the bleeding. I also have participated locally in lobbying for a Senate bill, actually it was an Assembly bill this week, where we're basically trying to make a difference here and try to pass a bill in California where we could do that. But I've also advocated at the Board of Supervisors with my congressman, my senator. And it's important to sort of stand up for something that's important. And we have to, first of all, get an answer for why people hurt themselves from gun violence, and also try to make a difference in people's lives. So the third thing I'm going to talk about is advocating for institution that you work in, and I'll go through this fairly quickly. I've been fortunate to work at a wonderful place, the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, also known as the General, for many years. So now we were threatened a number of years ago where, because of Senate Bill 1953, we had to put through a proposition which was the biggest proposition in the history of San Francisco. Now, I worked with many other people, some in this room, to try to make a difference, helping doing campaign stops with Board of Supervisors, working with the mayor's office, doing commercials and other things to really help the cause. And by doing that, we were able to pass Prop A and make sure we fund a new building, which just opened within the last year. The second experience I've had with doing that is last year we had Prop A again, where we basically funded retrofit of the building that we're in now. And that was quite interesting, sort of being involved with commercials and other things like that, billboards and what have you. But I've been very fortunate to work at a great place, and I'm very passionate with making sure that we continue to do all the great work we have. So 3 messages. Advocate for your patients, number 1. Number 2, advocate for issues that you're passionate about, that we need to learn more about. And number 3, advocate for institutions that you believe in strongly, that you can make a difference in people's lives. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good job. That's great, Andre. Our next speaker is Tracy Woodruff, who's the director of the Program of Reproductive Health and the Environment, who will talk to us about her work on the impact of environmental toxins on health and justice. Tracy?
Great. I'm going to stand up too, because we're all standing up for science today, right? So this is a great day. I was talking to my husband about this, and I'm like, I'm going to say that today is Earth Day. And he's like, isn't everyone going to talk about that? But apparently I'm the first. So I just want to say that today is Earth Day. And you know what? There's a reason why these are together, yes. So I had a little secret. I was like, oh, what is the history of Earth Day? Anyway, so, Earth Day was started in 1970 with thousands of teach-ins all across the country, just like this one. But Earth Day was very focused on the environmental degradation and its effects on human health. And back in the 1970s, we saw all these problems because I'll just give you one example. Lead. Everyone knows that lead hurts children's brains. Lead was in gasoline, lead was in food cans, lead was in paint, lead was in children. The average level of lead in children in the 1970s, we would consider poisoned today. 3 times what we would consider poison today. So what happened? People talked about the science, people advocated about the science, people passed laws, and they advocated on behalf of public policies that took lead out of gasoline, lead out of paint, lead out of food cans, and now children in the United States have lead levels that were inconceivable in the 1970s. But we have a new challenge ahead of us on the environmental front, because at least we dealt with some of these air pollutants, but in the meantime, we've seen a growth in all the other types of industrial chemicals that are manufactured and used in the United States. So we've seen a growth since the 1950s in over 15-fold in these chemicals. They're everywhere. They're in air, they're in our water, they're in our food. We get exposed to them through all these various products that we have in our daily life, whether they're things like you've probably heard about in the news, like plasticizers like BPA or phthalates or flame retardants. And the data show that in the United States alone, there are 30,000 pounds, that's 15 tons, that's a lot of elephants, for example, of chemicals per person that are manufactured and imported in the United States. So we're all exposed to these chemicals. And when I came to UCSF, it was kind of a transition time because we're starting to see these changing conditions that were happening in children. Conditions like obesity, diabetes, ADHD, and autism, we now know have all increased in children over a relatively short time. What else is going? It must be something that's going on around the environment that is impacting these children. And environmental chemicals have gone up too, and there must be a link between here. So our goal at UCSF is we focus on identifying, understanding these exposures that happen during developmental periods that are sensitive to these perturbations from these small molecules and how that influences health. But importantly, it's not just science as we're talking about today, but how do we connect that science to doing something about preventing these harmful chemical exposures? Because when that child is sick, it's too late for them. It's too late to solve the problem of this environmental exposure. So we're all about prevention. And what we've done is when we got here, we said, we should be working with the clinical community to advocate, like people like up here, to advocate on behalf of children to advance the public policies that will prevent exposures to everybody in the population, no matter who's at risk. And so we said, well, who would be our natural partner? That would be obstetricians. They work with pregnant patients. We are studying pregnant patients. They are advocates on behalf of pregnant patients, but also they have a personal connection to their patients, and they speak with authority in public policy arenas. People listen to doctors. I mean, they listen to scientists too, but they really like to listen to doctors. So like, okay, who is the society that represents OBGYNs, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists? What do they know about environmental chemicals? We look at their journals. I think there was like one paper on radiation risks from flying in an airplane when you're pregnant. That's not a lot of information. So they clearly didn't really know about this. So what did? First we did the science. We said, okay, let's show that this is an issue that they should care about. We did a study showing that pregnant women across the United States are exposed to at least 43 different industrial chemicals, probably more, that many of them at levels that are associated with adverse reproductive health and developmental health, adverse pregnancy outcomes or childhood outcomes, or even on into adulthood. So we show that this is a problem. 2, we talk to them in a language that they understand. We say, look, these chemicals, they look and they act, a lot of them look and act like hormones. So if you mess with hormones during pregnancy, so OBs know, yep, mess with hormones during pregnancy, that's bad. That's going to be bad for reproductive health outcomes. That's going to be bad for developmental outcomes. So if these chemicals look like hormones and act like hormones, that must be bad. So the third thing we talk to them about is, you deal with drugs all the time, so you know to prescribe them, and you know that those are regulated by the government. But you know what? Chemicals aren't. They aren't required to be tested before they go on the marketplace. There was no law I mean, there's an upgrade in the law now, but there is no law that makes sure that all these chemicals that are everywhere and measured in all of us, that they're safe for use. This aha moment was key to their saying, you know what, we should care about this issue. So the Dr. Jeannie Conroy, who is the president of the local professional society, which I will call ACOG for short, said, you know what, this is my signature issue when I'm president. She became president of ACOG. She made environmental reproductive health her signature issue. She, along with the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, who was being led at the time by Dr. Linda Judice, who was here at UCSF, along with our program on reproductive health, we wrote a joint committee opinion that said, science shows that environmental chemicals are harming reproductive health and development. Secondly, it said, we need to do more to advocate on behalf of our patients, including public policies that we need to prevent exposures to these harmful chemicals in our environment. And they have gone on to be great advocates in partnership with ourselves. So what we're doing, because obviously this administration is a renewed threat to environmental exposures and their effects on us, so we have been speaking up with our partners in ACOG and other scientists. And we just last week, or 2 weeks ago, hosted a legislative briefing in Washington, D.C. to bring together scientists to talk about why science matters, why the environment matters, and why it matters for our health. And I know that we've had some successes, but we have many challenges ahead of us. And I think all the words that we have heard before about being persistent and talking about our science will make a difference, though it will be a long road ahead. So thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Our final speaker will be Dr. Sunil Caliwad, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine, who's going to talk about the importance of basic research in our efforts to prevent and treat and cure human disease. Sunil?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for coming today. It's a little bit later in the morning, but good morning to all of you. It's yeah, it would actually be the beginning of my morning if it wasn't this special day today. So with that, my job in the next few minutes is to connect with you, hopefully in a different way, and to make a point that leads to hopefully a call to action. And the point starts with the fact that I'm beginning in this process as a scientist myself, and I think many of us, even if we've been in this game for a long time, may over the last year or so have felt a stirring, an inclination that maybe we need to be doing more than what we've been doing until now. And I'm going to share with you my story and where I am right now and why I've gotten to the point I've gotten to. I agree with everything that the other panelists have said so far, specifically with respect to making the argument that basic science research is a good investment. If you look at every dollar spent towards NIH funding, there's an 8x return on investment with respect to the country in general. There is no other return on investment. And you can make all the institution here at UCSF has been incredibly forceful in making that point strongly to legislators both at the state level and the federal level. I think we should continue doing that. I also received NIH funding as an undergraduate. I received an F-32 as a graduate student and a T-32 NIH grant as an endocrinology fellow. And on my final go-around, got a K-08, which allowed me to have a career development award that then was the springboard for my scientific position and faculty hire. And I've received an one grant now finally since then. And I feel like the commitment that I've demonstrated as a scientist, going back from 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of residency, a chief residency, a fellowship, a PhD, a postdoc, and then I finally get my first job, gives me a position to argue that NIH funding is important. And we make that argument sometimes to lawmakers and say, you know, trust us, we know what needs to happen. I will tell you that in the last year, I've met with lawmakers for the first time, and I've found that there are different tactics that work perhaps better than the tactics. For whatever reason, we have not been able to make the point, like NASA has made, that we wouldn't have microwave ovens if we didn't fund NASA. The general population, that talk to people across the country, and they say, yep, I get it. Argument has not resonated as strongly with the population as a whole, and I'll tell you in the last few minutes what I've come to realize might to get this point across better. When I think about my area of research, which is diabetes, there are 2 points that have resonated with lawmakers, and I've met with all of ours locally, all of ours at the state level, our 2 senators, and congressional leaders now on the Hill in the last year as part of the American Diabetes Association. The 2 things that have caused people to turn, listen, and engage with me that I think we could all tap into. 1, my mom has diabetes. And so my link to studying diabetes is fundamentally different because it doesn't just excite me. I can talk to you about glucose and how it impacts cells all day long. But I don't think the general population decides what they want to support because I think glucose is cool. I think that they would be more likely to support my research because diabetes affects their families. And if I am like them because diabetes affects my family, then we have something in common. And that's a point that I think we need to make more strongly, that basic research funds initial insights into diseases that we as scientists also experience as human beings and as members of society, not just as scientists who think that the molecular mechanisms are intriguing. The second point, I think, that is worth making whenever we get the chance, and I would encourage us to start making these points locally, at the state level, and nationally, more and more, and maybe even starting today. And that is, I experience life in this country as a citizen every bit as much as I experience it as a scientist. I play softball in our local softball league every Thursday night. My kids have issues that my wife and I have to attend to on a weekly basis. We worry about how to make ends meet. We worry about how to fund college. We worry about all the same things, including health and disease, that everybody else who lives in this country worries about. And I think that when we make ourselves more human as scientists, and when we talk to our lawmakers and lobby Congress as people who experience everything else that the average citizen who is not a scientist experiences, then our arguments to fund science hold weight on a different level. And I feel like right now, today, we have an opportunity to start thinking about basic science research funding from all of these perspectives, and it is incumbent on us to start doing that. Because when we make the argument on these multiple fronts, as I had the experience for the very first time to know firsthand 2 weeks ago when I was on Capitol Hill during the ADA's call to Congress, I realized that people in Congress don't fail to understand the value of what we do because they're dumb. That is not the truth. In fact, I met a lot of really smart people in the offices, most of whom are less than 25 years old, just for your information, that seem to be running the show in Washington, in the offices of all of these congressional leaders. They're smart kids, and they're smart people. And when you make arguments in ways that connect, you can change people's minds. And I saw people's minds being changed because we had real conversations on real levels as real people. And I would encourage us to utilize human beings as much as we are scientists, point as many times as we can going forward. Because when I was hired at UCSF in 2011, there was another election that happened right after I started. And during that election, the vice presidential candidate in the ticket that ultimately ended up losing that campaign made the point that NIH funding is suspect because those individuals work on fruit flies and worms and things like that. And even the tone of voice suggested the skepticism that we must all have to fund something where people do such things with the money we give them. Of course, they don't realize that fundamental research into cells and flies and model organisms ultimately leads to better understandings in animal models that do resemble people and ultimately in people themselves. And that's a tough argument to make when people who have a microphone and an audience make a counter-argument. But if we can connect and say, look, we're people too. We have these diseases in our families. We live in communities that are affected by diseases. I also work at San Francisco, and I've found that my patients work hard for the money they earn. And they come to me in diabetes clinic at the General Hospital, and they don't exhibit indications of to warrant funding because they don't deserve it as much as anybody else does. In fact, I've seen only the contrary to that over all these years. And so I can make a case for funding basic science research that has nothing to do with talking about cells, has nothing to do with talking about molecules, and I find that it might connect better than the arguments that we traditionally make. And so I would like to leave you with that encouragement to go out, think about how you are parts of society in ways that you may not have considered yourselves as being before today, and use that understanding to connect with your leaders in ways that can couple with the immense amount of expertise we have as scientists and clinicians, and also the importance of these diseases to the future of our country. So with that, thank you.
That's great, Sunil. I would like to encourage one more round of applause for these amazing people who and to all of you for being here this morning to listen to it. So yes. So we have time now for questions, and there will be answers. There's a mic, this one, that will be passed around. I'm not quite sure who's moving them. If I see any hands raised, I'll point to you. If I don't, I'll throw in questions of my own, which I will, aha. In the back, yes.
I want to thank you for all of the presentations. I am totally amazed. I feel so honored to be in the presence of such important people whose contributions I really admire. I have been a part of this institution since my earliest training over 35 years ago in some various components of activity in the Department of Psychiatry. I think one of the things that all of you have said, which I think is so incredibly important, is how we understand from a scientific point of view the challenges that we face in our world. And each of you have spoken in a very special way about that. But one important topic that hasn't been spoken to yet is how we understand the scientific basis and then the implications for that for the most catastrophic health problem that we face in the 21st century, that of the impact of climate disruption and global climate change. And that needs to also be an important area where those of us who understand and apply scientific understanding to the advocacy work that you have all spoken about, to do something about this catastrophic threat that we are facing. My particular area is, as a psychiatrist, to understand something about the health impacts of climate change, and specifically the mental health impacts of climate change, which are quite ubiquitous. I want to thank you particularly for talking about speaking in normal people language. That is something that we should all be able to do about our understanding. And I want to also say, having been on the Hill many times with legislators, that speaking about that in normal human language does have an impact. We have a lot of work, though, to do as we translate our understanding about science of climate change to effective policies, and we're all in danger of that now.
Great talk. Thank you for your presentations. So I was wondering, are there lobby groups that solicit Congress on behalf of scientists?
All the time.
All the time? Do they throw money at the issue, like support campaigns?
Yeah, all the time.
Well, the other thing, actually, I don't know if you even touched on this, but UCSF has a person in Washington, D.C. that does congressional relations. So I think maybe probably you've all done this. Unless my mic on. But I just would say that that facilitate, if you go to D.C. and you want to meet with different representatives, her name's Natalie Alpert, she'll set all those meetings up. When we were there to do our congressional briefing, she and the person who also runs congressional affairs from the University of California set up all these meetings with different legislators, staff in the Senate and in the House, did all our prep work. So they encourage anybody from this institution to go and talk with people in D.C. about the issues that they are concerned about.
Legislated in 2 weeks, we have our annual lobby session at the American College, for the American College of Surgeons. So I'm going to go to D.C. and meet with everyone. And what he says is absolutely right. The country and the politicians' office is run by 25-year-old people who basically, you're told, you walk in, you talk to them, you give them the briefing, you let them know what's going on, and you advocate for the issues you have, so that our national organization, the American College of Surgeons, has a whole program that they have. They put us through. We meet with Congress people, the senators, and anyone else that we can meet with during that period of time. But it is striking because you'll walk around, but there will be thousands of other people doing exactly what you're doing too. And if you're lucky, you get in to see your congressperson and you get a chance to talk to them. Sometimes you talk to a staffer, but you make sure that whatever argument you make, that you make it aggressively and you let them know that these are things that we found important, whether that, for me, it's trauma and the impact of trauma on people's lives, diabetes, or whatever the issue is that you're dealing with. You make sure they know that this is an important constituency for them. So I'll say I represent 50,000, 100,000 surgeons doing that. They're like, well, I just had somebody in here who just represents 2 million people. Right, so that's kind of the things that you're dealing with.
Before we move to the third question, I think there were some comments that were Tracy and
Yep.
Oh, I just...
Well, in regards to your climate change question, we've taken that very seriously. And I run the largest study of minority children with asthma in the United States. And we demonstrated recently that for a given amount of air pollution, African American children were far more susceptible to developing asthma than their peers, their neighbors who were exposed to the same level of air pollution. The important thing is that the level of air pollution was far below current EPA standards. And as my colleague to my left had mentioned, it was a nice publication, but it's kind of like a tree falling in the forest, the academic forest. So what we've gone to do is public advocacy. And I just did a public service announcement for KBLX, which is the largest minority-owned radio station in the Bay Area, announcing that it's important for minority communities to step up and be active. Along the lines of advocacy, we've demonstrated that the NIH has had a poor track record with the inclusion of women and minorities, particularly in clinical biomedical research. We've taken them to the mat. It's interesting that we publish articles that fall on deaf ears amongst our colleagues, and that's why we went to Congresswoman Barbara Lee to force the NIH to make changes. And that's something that's very important, the social advocacy of what we do in addition to doing top quality science. So those are ways that we get involved. And on a last note, the lack of diversity in clinical biomedical research, as I mentioned, has real impacts. And as the last speaker had just mentioned, it hits us personally. I lived with a Chinese family when I was younger, and as I mentioned, the #1 drug doesn't work in 50% of Asians. And unfortunately, on August 24th, my younger brother, who's Asian, passed away from an adverse drug reaction to a cardiovascular medication. And so my goal of advancing precision medicine, not only for the sake of science, but making precision medicine socially precise, has now hit home. And I'm a big advocate. I teach all my students that you have to stand up, you have to have representation in clinical and biomedical research. Along the notes, and I want to say that I'm very proud to be part of UCSF, because when we exposed the NIH that they were falling down on the job, that 10% of investigators who applied for NIH grants, if you're African American, you had a 10% lower likelihood of being funded. If you're Asian, you had an 8% lower likelihood of funding. And we used Freedom of Information Act over the last 30 years to expose that. When we were about to publish that, I received threats from the NIH. And I went to the Chancellor, Sam Hallgood. I went to my Dean, Talmadge King, Joe Guglielmo. I said, do you want me to publish this? Because it's going to put us at risk. Universally, they all said no. This is what we do. We're going to back you. Go ahead and publish what you do. And that's why I'm so proud to be part of an institution that has a moral spine, in addition to doing great science.
We have another question over here.
Sure, just wanted to say thanks again for being here this morning. This is an incredible way to spend a Saturday morning, and I'm so grateful that you all are giving your time to talk about this. My question, the science of making convincing arguments and affecting change, and my question for you all is, to what extent did your training provide provide that curricula about making effective arguments, affecting and sustaining change, so that the really amazing work that you all do can have its maximum impact?
I can take the first stab maybe at that. From my standpoint, it did not. My training did not provide me with any real understanding of how I might start voicing myself in this regard. And I think that I've found over the last year now, as a relatively junior faculty member here at UCSF, that's a fairly ubiquitous sentiment that my colleagues hold. We created a human obesity cohort at UCSF that is noteworthy because it is multi-ethnic, and we took advantage of the ethnic diversity of our Bay Area in constructing it. I only bring this up because since we've developed this cohort, no less than 10 different basic science investigators have contacted me very enthusiastically to try to get samples, connect with the cohort. And why? Because they want to show the human relevance of their own research by using human samples, human cohort members, to try to take their research up to the next level. Everybody who's in science understands that they want to make their research as applicable to people at large as possible. And what we need to learn how to do is make that point, which is true of all of us in science, readily evident to average people who are considering how they're going to view the scientific enterprise in this country in general. And we don't really learn how to make that argument. And what I've learned over the last several weeks now in talking to congressional leaders is just that if you look inwardly, you find a lot of those answers, because they're in the way you interact with your own community, your own family, your own ethnicity, outside of the fact that you're a scientist. Mm-hmm. And you draw from those experiences and you try to create arguments that incorporate that aspect of yourself every bit as much as the scientific expertise.
I would add to that, though. I agree with that. I think we all know how to speak, but we don't all know how to speak to congressional staffers. Yeah. And I think creating an expectation where we know how to do that when our skills are derived from a very different set is an unreasonable expectation. So I think for the most part, most of us have taught ourselves and listened to other people, and probably we could do a better job of educating ourselves as a community on how do you do that.
I want to add, because this is another great story about UCSF. Because I went to Stanford, I went to Harvard, I spent the last 20 years here at UCSF, and I witnessed something that was incredible that has given me permission to do what I do. I'm a pulmonologist. The number one cause of death for HIV patients when I was doing training, lung disease. I watched young men die left and right when I was in training here as a medical student at Stanford and here as a pulmonary fellow. We have great HIV scientists here. But like she said, it's one thing to publish a paper and have it fall in the academic forest on deaf ears. But we also are UCSF. We're also San Francisco. And we have great political activism. And when ACT UP, the AIDS activist group, paired up with the UCSF scientists, they were able to push pressure, armbar the NIH, the FDA to fast-track drugs. So I watched HIV in my career under my nose in the last 20 years go from a death sentence to a manageable disease like diabetes. And that was great because UCSF gave me the permission to be a social advocate, push hard on inclusion of diversity in clinical and biomedical research without feeling that I'd feel repercussions from the university. And I could tell you at the other institutions I would have been silenced.
So my question actually deals exactly with that. We've talked a lot about federal government, but we haven't talked about the self-censorship that happens within our professional societies. So I'm in the dermatology department, and I haven't been personally involved with this, but I know of an article that went into JAMA Dermatology about dermatology and immigrants. And dermatology, for those of you who don't know, is essentially founded on immigrants from Nazi Germany. That's what American dermatology is. So it went in, it was accepted, the authors got the proofs, and then it got pulled. And so this issue doesn't even get to the federal government. We do this to ourselves, and I'd be interested in how the panel has dealt with that kind of censorship.
I've gone on the public radio airways. I just did it.
I mean, I think it's a challenge because working within our professional societies is really what we're taught to do, and they're our largest advocates. So, you know, having a group of 100,000 surgeons try to advocate at Congress is a pretty powerful force. And if you have someone who has views that are contrary to your professional society, it's a behemoth that you have to argue against. But the issue is really very real. And I would say that relying on good science is what you can do to start. And then just don't give up. Realize that you have a message to tell. And some people, be it the government or your professional colleagues, may not like that message. Yeah. And just be persistent and keep telling it. I think the airwaves are a great way to tell it. I think getting other groups together to help become another, bringing together the press, public, other groups, patient groups to help. But I think my personal conflicts have been mostly in the sphere that you were talking about.
Just may address that just for a minute. So there's been a big push in our society with trauma surgeons and board of governors and American College of Surgeons to say something about common sense gun safety legislation. And we actually did a survey where they looked at the surgeons who had guns who cared for trauma victims.
Yeah.
And they looked at non-surgeons who didn't have guns. They found that pretty much 90% of the stuff, like basically not selling it to folks who have psychiatric illnesses, basically smaller clips, not using lethal, bullet, all these things that actually there was a lot of agreement. So we basically, there was one group in the Committee on Trauma, the American College of Surgeons agreed with it, the governors agreed with it, the leadership of the college, then we put this whole product out to the general membership, and of course, the first thing that started happening is that people said, well, you're going to take my guns away from me. Right, and this is like, it has nothing to do with this. Is just like, okay, like we agree that there's time for common sense gun safety after Sandy Hook, after Orlando, after all these things that have happened to do it. But then, we're still fighting amongst ourselves. So for me, it's kind of, these things are non-brainers if somebody lives in the bluest part of the blue state of California, right? I mean, when we talk to our representatives, it's easy. When you're talking to the people who represent us in general, we may have some issues, but it's quite different than when you're in the red state of Alabama or some other place than, the folks that we have here. So they will actually listen to us, whether that's Nancy Pelosi or Jackie Street, my congressperson, or Senator Harris or Senator Price. They'll listen to kind of what we have, because what we're saying is fairly reasonable stuff. But we, in our society, we still have a struggle with that, because as soon as that we say this is common sense things that need to happen, they're like, well, you're going to take our guns away from me. It's like, no, we're not. This is not about your Second Amendment rights. This is about doing something that's sensible so that people do not get killed. So we do struggle in our own society.
We have a microphone for a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Here and a very patient hand over here.
I don't know if the mic's on or not. A few weeks ago, when the House of Representatives was beginning to work on the replacement or repeal of Affordable Care Act, my daughter here in San Francisco got very involved and got me involved along with my wife. And so we ended up going down to meet with Kamala Harris's aides. And I asked the question there, how do I reach across? How do I reach across to Congress? Because my representatives agree with me. How do I reach across? And the reason I feel hopeful this morning is not only for the people that are facing me on the panel, but the people that are sitting next to me in the seats. We're all looking for ways to advocate, which is really, really wonderful to see at my point in life. What the aides said is, don't do all those emails. I was sending out hundreds of emails because it's so easy. That's not what's read. Get on the phone, call some representative in another state, the numbers are on the internet, and give a personal story. That's what was said, the speaker to the right. That's exactly it, the personal story. Take one or two items on a particular bill and tell your story about that particular bill. Now, how do you hear about these bills? Through the lobbying groups, through the advocate groups, through the professional groups. In my case, the American College of Physicians. Some nonprofits I give to, Planned Parenthood. These are groups that are going to tell me what bills are coming before Congress. I can then find out what committee's dealing with it. I can find out the representative's name. I can call and give a personal story. The people are much younger than me, but they listen to me and they really take it in as a personal story. Thank you all.
Can I add to that real quick? Because that's a great point. Personal stories. If you go from Susan's 3 stories all the way down, it's the stories that made the point. And I got exactly the same information when I talked to Kamala Harris's staffers, as well as all the other staffers. And the other point is that they use those personal stories, even if you preach to the choir, as Andre just mentioned, living here where we do, they take the personal stories that we arm them with, and they apply those personal stories when they're reaching across the aisle in contentious debates that we're not a part of. And so when we give them those stories, we give them power in places where we're no longer standing next to them, but they feel our presence through those stories. So I told a story of a kid with type 2 diabetes, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in an area in the Inland Empire of Southern California, San Bernardino area. And in that county of Southern California, last year, the rates of type 2 diabetes in children ages 14 to 19 were higher than the rates of type 1 diabetes in that same age group, which is a turning point. And California is leading the way because of our ethnic diversity in finding these pockets of risk. And you can make that point statistically, it doesn't resonate. You talk about one kid who's diagnosed with type 2 diabetes who shouldn't even have diabetes at all, it's preventable, it starts resonating. And I think we need to do more of that, put stories to the work we do.
I want to follow up on that. I mean, I completely agree that these personal stories are very compelling, but I think the other thing that we have that is unique to us is we do, I mean, your information about statistics, so it is true that most people who are staffers in Washington, D.C. are under 25, but there are actually senior staffers who work for the committees. Yes. So like we went to go meet with the committee representatives for Environment and Public Works. That's the committee that deals with all the climate change, environmental regulations.
those people have actually been around for a long time, and they're actually a little more steeped in some of the nuances of public policy and decision and data, and they actually need the kinds of stats and figures that we've been talking about. So, for example, one of the things that we talk about is this administration has said that environmental regulations are a cost to industry. What they're not saying is environmental regulations have a health benefit for everybody in the United States, and that the benefits far outweigh the costs, and that we've seen air pollution go down while the economy has grown. Those kinds of quantitative information is actually a good supplement to these stories that people have. Because then they can say, when people are like, oh, blah, 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 cost the economy, you're like, oh, yeah, really? What about the health of the public? Health of the public is improved in these ways. So I think you have to have both things, and there are different types of people in D.C. too. So.
I'll just say just briefly, so this week when I was helping the lobby for AB 909, Stop the Bleeding in California, so we went back and forth with membership of the American College of Surgeons, Northern California, Southern California, us, and the representative who carried the bill turns out to be a Republican from San Bernardino. And I walk in his office, I meet him, and I was talking to him. He's actually a very reasonable guy, and I'm just like, oh, Jesus, he's very reasonable. And he carried the bill. It's like, why are you carrying this bill? Because he's in San Bernardino, and San Bernardino is where this kid was just killed, where that terrible thing happened in that mental health facility where multiple people were killed in the terrorist attack that happened a year ago. And he's seeing that this is an important bill, and what he's doing is he's partnering with other people. He's like, well, I need a partner. I didn't even actually, before I got in his office, I didn't know he was a Republican, but I was just like, okay. But he was terrific, and he understood what the problem was, and he said, I'm looking for a partner on the other side to walk this legislation through, because it makes so much sense, so that there are people who are more moderate, who you can talk to about sensible things to do. So after these things happen, there are people who just say, wow, that's a great idea. Whether it's diabetes or stuff I do, or stuff that she's talked about, or HIV. There's a lot of people who are sensible, and we're going to have to really look for sensible people, because Lord knows there's not a lot of sense going on in D.C. right now. Every day I'm like, Lord Jesus, what's going to happen?
All right, we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
The guy
here.
on the right, patient.
Good morning. My name is Annette Gardner. I'm a political scientist here at UCSF. I'm just a general shout out for social scientists. We rock too. Back to this question of learning about advocacy, resources, and the like, I just want to say that we do harbor folks like myself who can actually inform you as to what is working and what is not. And another shout out, Claire Brindis and I just came out with a book on evaluating advocacy and policy change. So yes, we have these resources here at UCSF to support your efforts, because like Tracy said, it is not just about the personal stories, but the data has to be in there somewhere. And yes, it is about talking to the youngsters and the staffers, because you're never going to get to Nancy and Camilla and Diane. So this is political science, and we're here to help inform your efforts. Thanks.
Thank you. One last question. Sorry.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for being here. My question was about when we have limited funding and limited mic time and limited public attention, how the different scientific communities, I think, that would agree with a lot of the research that's being done with each other. For example, Dr. Khan, you were talking about HIV prevention and treatment, how we can manage the limited resources that we have and still be able to create these conversations where there is a lot of agreement and there is a lot of energy, even as our political climate is encouraging that we kind of fight over the remaining times and encouraging those divisions. So I was hoping that you might share examples or kind of tips in helping keep the conversation united as we go forward.
That was not a planted question, but that feeds right into what I was just going to say. And we all, I think, it's really special at the end of the day, but we have to get everybody to know the impact in the future. And you have to keep on doing it. And, we're going to give you the opportunity, and I think maybe you would have collected a card when you came in, to write on that card what you think should happen and send that to your congressperson. If you write on the card, you will be able to drop those off at the back of the room. It's those connections over and over and over again which will make things change. I mean, I'm, as the, maybe, I think it's probably fair to say, elder statesman, or elder person here. I mean, I remember back in the 60s, you know, we just had to keep on going. And that, we're in no less of a crisis today. And that is what has to happen. So I know that the panel would, and they will be outside, but I'm supposed to now herd you outside, because we're going to have a rally, which is another thing you do, and a march is the third thing you do. So I hope that answered your question a little bit. Thanks for asking it. So thank you all for coming. The rally will be outside on the steps at Genentech Hall right now.